Well, thank you so much for joining us here this morning. It's such a delight to be here, both, as Stephen said, to see everybody in person again, which is a real treat, but also for me to be hosting this panel on global trade and investment megatrends, which is something that I've been reporting on over the last few years, and which is clearly such an important topic. As Stephen outlined, I think our presumptions about the future of global trade have just shifted immeasurably. And so one of the things that we want to look at on the panel today really is the future of global trade, some of the challenges that we're seeing at the moment, but also the opportunities. We are experiencing extraordinarily turbulent times. The atrocities going on in Ukraine, the knock-on effect of that on the global economy, the continuing pandemic and lockdowns in China, or even though we're sitting here today without masks, that's a very different story in Shanghai. And so I am delighted to welcome a stellar panel to talk about all of these issues this morning. And forgive me if I have to look at my notes to read you all of their titles, because they all wear many hats. But if I start with Bruce Carnegie-Brown, who is the chair of Lloyd's of London, also the chair of Banco Santander and the MCC, as well as the chair of the TheCityUK's Leadership Council, which brings the financial industry's leading practitioners together to look at the organisation's strategy. Good morning. Linda Yueh, a familiar face to me from her time at the BBC and a regular guest on the Today programme with me as well. She's a fellow in economics at St Edmund Hall, Oxford University, as well as an adjunct professor of economics at the London Business School, a visiting professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and chair of Baillie Gifford's Fund for Long-Term Investors, and an advisor to the UK Board of Trade. Good morning and welcome. Ketan Patel, he's the founder and chair of Force for Good, which examines and engages the world's leading global financial institutions to look at how capital can be a force for good in the world. That includes supporting the UN Secretary General's Roadmap for Sustainable Development. He also co-founded and leads Greater Pacific Capital, which invests in high-growth enterprises that make an impact locally, internationally, profitably, and sustainably. Good morning to you. And finally, Bill Coen, who served as Secretary General of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision from 2014 to 2019, something I remember well. And he's also worked for the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve and currently serves as an independent non-exec of the China Construction Bank, the world's second largest bank. He's also on the Global Advisory Board for Mitsubishi and chairs the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation Advisory Council. Good morning. Well, thank you so much all for joining us. If I could just kick off with a question, because we're taking a very sort of macro view on this subject. Starting with you, Bruce. From where you're sitting, what do you think are the biggest risks at the moment to the global investment environment?
Thank you, and good morning. For me, it's the way what appear to be local events cascade internationally really very quickly. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about coronavirus originating in China but being an ever-present issue around the world, or even Ukraine, limited by geography in terms of the conflict, but immediately spilling into huge humanitarian issues and huge economic issues. And so the ability for these things to become systemic really quite quickly. And of course, in addition, the world faces what is perhaps the greatest of systemic risks around climate change. And I think it's that issue that piles on the complexity and the uncertainty that we were hearing about just now that really potentially damages confidence in making investment decisions.
And Linda, could I ask the same question to you then? I mean, clearly a lot of what you do is focusing on the Chinese economy as well.
Yes, I think I'd probably highlight, there's probably a lot of risks to highlight, but I would probably highlight three. So one is, has the recent supply-side shocks derailed the underlying, essentially fundamentals for the global economy, which were actually fairly good, and which I know Katie will come to, in terms of a new middle class, in terms of digitalization of trade, many of the things that we heard this morning. I think the second area is around ESG and how you would apply that to investment propositions in, for instance, China and other places. And then I think the third area that I would highlight is around, are we at the cusp of an age of disruption? So, we seem to, I chair, as Katie said, Baillie Gifford's Schiehallion Fund, and we only invest in potential unicorns. And some of the valuations in that area and some of the potentially transformative companies, all of that is very much either going to take us to a breakthrough moment where we begin to see technology really transforming our society, or are we on the cusp of a pretty big bubble, in which case there's a lot of risks around that. So if I may, just coming back to the first point for just a sec, in terms of it's not just the supply side shocks that I'm describing. It's very hard for policymakers to deal with. So, for instance, if you have supply chain tensions, and we, of course, have spikes in commodity prices, energy prices, people who have lived through the 1970s tell me this is not the 1970s. And I would say, in one respect, it's not stagflation, because the underlying economies where the supply shocks are hitting have essentially pretty close to full employment. We're not in a situation where the economy is in a different part of the cycle. But monetary policy can do very little on supply side shocks. So the question that I think it matters for investment is, does this change, will the stagnant incomes change the underlying growth picture that lots of companies and investors are banking on when they're making these investment decisions around the world? So we can come back to the other two, but I think to me these are the immediate shocks to investment that we just all need to, I think, make a decision on and take an assessment of.
No calmer and quieter time ahead. And
Yeah.
Ketan, when you're making those investment decisions, what are you seeing as those major risks?
So I think what we're seeing is that there was a planning assumption that you could take the past and extrapolate it and build trend lines, and that no longer seems true. The level of disruption, I think, as Bruce said too, you find it appearing in one part of the world and it's contagious. Poor choice of words, I'm sure, right now, given we're in a pandemic. But ideas are contagious, and events are contagious, and they seem to affect the whole system. So in each of our planning departments will be somebody whose job it is to model these risks out. And I think what we've learned is that an individual risk magnified derails the whole model. And so from the work that we did looking at the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, you saw 17 factors that we thought needed to be managed and funded to 2030. But now I think what we're seeing is that one event, a conflict in Europe, a big event, can derail almost the whole focus on the 17 for a period. And so the flow of capital changes, the decision making has changed around that, and the likelihood of achieving a 2030 objective, which seemed like the funding was beginning to flow, is now derailed. And so I think perhaps the most disruptive factor is that you can't project with any degree of rational certainty without running a new model that takes into account things which seem like outliers, but which could actually take the center stage and change the model. And that level of uncertainty and risk, I think, is a new way of thinking required now for all of us, actually.
Does that tally with your experience, Bill, that unpredictability, the need for a new model?
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on a few themes. And first of all, certainly the uncertainty. I can't help but see things through the lens of the global financial crisis in my experience at the Basel Committee. But I remember well the paralysis in the system at the height of the global financial crisis, when there was this high degree of uncertainty and lack of confidence. Investors having a lack of confidence in banks, some banks having a lack of confidence in other banks, and it was crippling. And I don't think we've risen to that level yet, but there is that high degree of uncertainty. And let's face it, institutional retail investors who want to place their money at risk when the outcome is uncertain. So the uncertainty, the lack of confidence, I think is something that I have observed. The other things, and Linda has touched on this. I'm in London for a day of meetings at the IFRS, and their work these days is dominated by sustainability. So it's the ESG issue. I spent yesterday talking about financial innovation and cybersecurity, cyber risk, stable coins, NFTs. So here's the point. Being left behind, and there was a real risk that you know, if you haven't planned properly, if you haven't had the appropriate strategic planning, there's a substantial risk you're going to get left behind. And I also see the world through a regulatory lens. I can't help it, but at least now I'm on the other side of the fence. I didn't say I've moved to the dark side or to the bright side. I'm on a different side, but I do have a different perspective. And boy, you know, you talk about. I don't see it as disruption as much as I see it as innovation, but it really is an evolution. There's so much going on. It's such a tremendous effort and a tremendous spend to keep current with technology and risk management. So I think the pace of change, along with that uncertainty, really is a unique time.
Well, picking up on that regulation point then, Bruce, do you think there is anything that governments can do to mitigate for these very uncertain times, to step in some way?
Well, for me, the big issue, and unsurprising given my day jobs at Lloyd's of London, the issue of resilience is really important. I think we need to try to avoid getting into a globalization, de-globalization binary conversation. What we need to look at is how do we underpin the huge growth, economic growth, prosperity that's been created by globalization in terms of building resilience. And there's clearly an issue around economic resilience. You know, for too long in the liberal economic order, we've celebrated huge top-line growth, huge bottom-line growth, largely supported by extended supply chains, just-in-time delivery, quite a lot of gearing on the balance sheets of companies as well as individuals. And these have proved to be quite vulnerable when shocks have happened. And so I think there's a huge need for us to focus on resilience in supporting the economic model we like. The second thing I'd say is, I think in my lifetime, the rise of purpose has been quite important here. And actually, when you see purpose aligned with economic policy, I think you begin to have more confidence in what you're about. And this isn't just about Russia or even China. It's also, if you look at, as has been commented on, the UK leaving the EU, that has an impact in terms of purpose. What was the purpose behind us doing that? And of course, people would track back to the 4 years of Trump in the United States, the dislocation between the huge economic partnership that Europe and the US have from some of the dislocation of values. And I think, to me, this is an issue that business needs to grapple with, and governments have a responsibility for. So we talk a lot about, you know, trying to trade through some of these challenges, but actually many people are unwilling for us to do that. The people that ultimately elect our politicians, and so why one of the positives in the Ukraine situation is because the purpose is so aligned in terms of rebutting Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that I think the world's been able to respond much more quickly than many of us believed would be possible. And where there's a dislocation between our economics and our values, I think there's real risk.
Ketan, I'd like to ask you about that, because so much of what you do is investing with a purpose.
Yes.
Do you agree there that, in a sense, we've lost our direction a bit? We aren't focused enough on where we're going.
It does feel like we're at the end of big ideas and ideologies, but I would step back from that and actually say I think there are some very big hooks and changes going on in the world which will focus people's attention back to purpose, I believe. And I think one of them is that we're heading towards a multipolar world where the biggest trading blocs in the world are, number one, the EU, and therefore quite interesting how the UK's relationship will be with that trading bloc. Secondly, of course, America still is that great trading bloc and that great power, but China's that great power too, and by 2050 you'd expect India to be there. So in a multipolar world with four huge political, economic, well-populated trading blocs that are the most powerful, I think that's a different world. And so in that world, I think each country will have to figure out how they relate to those four, because the relationship between those four probably determines the geopolitical landscape. I'm not lost on the idea that our model of globalization, as Stephen said earlier too, is broken somewhat, and it's in transition. But if I go to another extreme, we're about to have 10 billion people on the planet. I mean, that's a massive trend, and an estimate that by 2050 there's 10 billion. And so probably the most powerful force for globalization in a world linked by technology is probably the individual. The Trump era, Brexit, the votes that are just about to happen in France, these are all going to be determinant of the politics of the day. And I think the individual interlinked completely through technology is probably a new metric, a new force of a different kind of globalization that we haven't seen yet. We've never had this level of linkage before to actually allow people to do that. And we have 2/3 of the world that are not participants yet in financial services as proper participants, the south of the world. And that probably is something that gets addressed through this interlinkage of all of us. And so I'm quite hopeful, actually, that there are big trends in place, big themes, if you like, that will drive each of us to figure out what is the purpose, and for companies and for countries, and probably around these four mega trading blocks.
It's interesting, you talk about interlinkage, but there's also been a massive dislocation, hasn't there?
Yeah.
For so many reasons, from Brexit and through the pandemic and for everything that we're seeing going on geopolitically. Linda, when you look at the four big trading blocks, are you positive that in future that we'll see some sort of convergence and greater interlinkage, or do you see the dislocation continuing?
I see a risk of fragmentation, but underlying it, closer linkages. Now, if that sounds like a contradiction, there's a phrase in diplomacy: constructive ambiguity is sometimes quite useful. Then there's a saying about how China can be a dozen contradictions before breakfast. I think that's the era in which we're headed. I think we're going to have both the forces that you just outlined in terms of connectivity, digital, linkages, and all of that is removing borders in a way that is accelerating the pace of change, and in that sense, the commercial aspects of globalization. But at the same time, on the economic model, on the geopolitical front, the differences are actually growing. And just taking the US and China as the most stark example, the US-China tensions are not really about trade. They're probably not even really about technology. They're probably around values and power and all the kinds of things that are very difficult to reconcile when you're dealing with superpowers. And I think this is why we're potentially heading into a world where you get a fragmented system. Now, generally, the answer to fragmentation is a global rules-based system. What you need to do is come together and to agree the level playing field, the terms on which companies would operate, would invest, would trade. But the challenge is when you bring in the power dynamics is you have to actually be willing to be at the table on these issues. And I think that's one of the issues. The second issue is the next phase of trade and globalization is very digital. It's very services-based, which means it's not about tariffs. It's much more about standards, regulations, norms, and very domestic in terms of the origins of those. And you're talking about blocks and countries with very different systems. So, for instance, I'm going to use this example, which was given to me by a data expert, so please excuse the generalization. But in China, the government owns your data. In the United States, companies own your data, and in Europe, we own our data. I think they mean that in theory. So when you're looking at the rapid growth of data and digitalization, and you want to prevent a fragmentation of the global system, you need to have common rules around data. Instead, we have a world, even at the moment, which is full of data localization requirements. So some of the recent UK trade deals, the FTAs, which are building on top of the existing FTAs, so the digital initiatives, are actually intended to remove digital localization rules and to try and enhance the free movement of information contradiction, which is the absolute underpin of trade in services, what's called the intangible economy, the invisible trade balance. So to me, that's the contradiction. I'm sure there won't be time to go into all the nuances of it, but I think we are headed into a world where how you reconcile the much greater people-to-people connectivity with all of the tensions which are around, I don't even know how to describe, why everybody wants to be a superpower, but apparently it is quite a thing. And so how you reconcile those things and, wanting to be the one that sets the global rules, that is very hard. And, we talked about the major blocs and countries, but there's also the rest of the world. They may indeed become rule receivers, and that's very challenging as well for a cohesive, global system. I'll just finish with this joke, which I'm told is a Brussels joke, but I think it applies generally. For those countries who are looking at the big blocs arguing over the rules, they're probably thinking, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So there are massive issues, I think, in terms of trying to build a much more cohesive multilateral system going forward. And yet at the same time, the opportunities are absolutely huge.
Well, let's continue the at the table theme. Bill, I'd love to hear your view on this, because you see things from the Chinese perspective, your work on the China Construction Bank, also from the US, and talking about the aftermath of the financial crisis and what you did to sort that out. Arguably, to Bruce's point, that was a time where there was purpose. Everyone was pointing in the same direction. Do you think we can learn anything from that to bring people to the table and on the regulatory point?
I have to remember that line, Linda, and I will certainly borrow that. There was an extraordinary thing that happened, and that was it did get everyone to the table. In fact, the Basel Committee, prior to the crisis, the global financial crisis, was 13 countries. It more than doubled in size as a result, and it brought in countries like China, Australia, Brazil, or the G20 plus an additional 7 countries. And that was an extraordinary thing, that this group set standards that represent 90% of the world's banking assets. One of the really interesting things that came from the crisis, aside from Basel III and everything that is part of Basel III, there was an agreement, and I know how elementary this sounds, but there was an agreement to actually not only improve the rules, but to actually implement them. I mean, it does sound so ridiculously elementary, but that's something that hadn't been done in the past, at least not in a consistent manner. And so this is pointing to the regulatory fragmentation issue, and I have been concerned about that for some time, but things were moving in the right direction. I think the pandemic, threw a bit of a spanner in the works, and that's okay. And there have been some delays in putting the full Basel III rules into place. But what concerns me is I'm starting to see glimpses of what we had seen 20 years ago, that the rules aren't being put in place as intended at the table, where 27 countries sat around and said, yes, we agree, we'll put these rules in place, and if we want to gold-plate it, which is sometimes pejorative because people make it sound like you're making the rules too tough. Other people, they don't call it gold-plating, they call it armor-plating. You're really armor-plating your jurisdiction and your banks. We're not seeing that. We're seeing some leakage, some weakening, particularly in the European Union, and that really is concerning. So it's interesting. What does that mean for other jurisdictions, particularly the UK, as it needs to put its Basel III rules in place? Is there a sense that you're putting your banks at a disadvantage by adopting the agreed-upon standard? Do you want to give your banks, not in the UK, but is the idea to give your banks a bit of a break in the short term by adopting a weaker standard? That doesn't do them a favor. It's a quick fix, but in the long run, it hurts everyone, including the investability of your country. And I've seen firsthand, I think of Singapore, Australia, they've got rigorous regimes, they've got well-respected supervisory frameworks, regulatory apparatus, and people, investors trust that, and that means a lot. So the regulatory fragmentation, the delay in putting the rules in place, And when the rules are put in place, they're being put in place at a weaker standard. And I think that in the long term, that's dangerous for the jurisdiction, but globally, I think it also presents a risk.
It's fascinating to hear that comparison. Thank you very much. Well, shortly we're going to throw questions open to the audience. So do think if you'd like to put your hand up or use the app or come to me, I think, through the Zoom app on the iPad.
Could I add a point to,
of course,
to what we just heard from Linda, which is if we have 4 big trading blocks with the right economics, I mean, even today they have between 30 and 60% of the world's trade, people, GDPs, agricultural land, and so on. If I link it to what Bruce said about purpose, I think there's a battle, of course, for whether the world will be run by democracies or by somebody who's not a democracy in China. And the growth of China is so profound and almost so unerring in terms of how it's now progressing that you'd expect that by something like 2030, China is bigger than America on almost every important economic metric. So it's likely the other 3 will have to work together if they're to match China. And I think the reason that becomes important is who sets the rules of engagement for the rest of the world and within their own markets. And so it's likely the EU, US, and India are the 3 big trading blocks that figure out how to join together so they can be the rule setters. And I think that's a tough world. It's a very tough world that we're headed into.
And in this tough world, in this tough, uncertain world, Bruce, do you see any opportunities, glimmers of hope, signs of positivity perhaps that we can end on?
Well, definitely. I mean, actually, it goes back to a comment that Bill made earlier. I think human ingenuity is ultimately the source of greatest hope. You look at a coronavirus leading to vaccination, you look at how quickly, imperfectly, but quickly the world has responded to the situation in Ukraine. I think we are enormously adaptable. I think our big challenges around climate, can we come together with the same urgency around climate as we've come together around Ukraine, for instance, when the impacts still seem a little bit beyond the horizon. And it's easy to compromise today without feeling the impact. But I think we're enormously adaptable. Technology clearly helps. It changes the dynamic of the cost and the integration of the world order. But I think there is optimism beneath this. And frankly, we're all optimistic creatures. So I think we need to invest in that part of the equation to preserve a lot of the good things that have developed. And the world is richer today than it's ever been. But that wealth has been imperfectly distributed. Not everybody has participated. There's a sort of weird issue going on here where, we're all supportive of Ukraine, but we don't really want to bear the economic impacts of sanctions against Russia. So we require our governments to nationalize risk, for instance. And you get into this place of moral hazard here, where I'm very happy to be out there chanting for Ukraine, but I really don't want my energy bills to double, thank you very much. And we've got to kind of join the dots on this, and I think it takes human ingenuity to do that, and I think we can.
Linda, do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely, on the human ingenuity. I'd probably say the greatest opportunities, and there's again quite a few in the interest of time, I'll probably just stress 2. One is technology, and the other one, it sounds counterintuitive, but is the breakdown in the economic consensus. So just on technology, so the great economist Robert Solow said, it's called the Solow paradox. You can see the computer age everywhere, except in the productivity data. So are we at the end of a second Engels pause, which, if you bear with me, was a 30-year period until 1840, when the Industrial Revolution did nothing for productivity and standards of living, and everybody said, oh, all these factories now, this is just a bubble. This is not going to do anything transformative. And then after Engels' pause, standards of living increased, and obviously the world transformed. So as we live in this digital age, and we seem to be surrounded by technology, and we're always still told we face slowing growth, why are wages so low, the kind of long-term stagnation picture. I think we could be on the cusp of of some pretty transformative technologies. But remember what I said at the very beginning about risk, trying to work out, well, how much of that is genuine, how much of that is a bit bubbly, it could burst. That is actually a big risk. And, and Bill will know this very well, financial innovations and other innovations, the regulation around it is going to lag behind. And so there's, but the opportunities, I think, for some of the tech that I've certainly seen is absolutely, it's absolutely encouraging, and it could really make a big, I think, difference to people's lives, which is ultimately what we all hope for technology would do. But it does require regulation and does require conversation around how you make that work better for society, which brings me to the second point. So I think the division that Ketan has outlined between democracies and non-democracies, the inequality that Bruce has mentioned, I think the economic consensus around what works has broken down, actually largely for many, many years has been building up. And a lot of it is centered actually on inequality and the environment. So now I think we're at a period where people want to work with purpose. I think there's a much greater focus on how you create a greater good. So rebuilding an economic consensus, which is fairer, greener. I think around globalization, we know there's losers. We've always known there's losers since the days of David Ricardo in the 18th century, and yet we don't seem to do very much about it. So rebuilding this consensus, bringing stakeholders together, all of that could actually fashion a economic system that has a much greater buy-in, and I think that makes a massive difference to how this world could evolve. And to me, that is an opportunity. It could facilitate the green transition. There's great opportunities for returns there if purpose is overlaid not just with returns immediately. So I think, to me, that's another great opportunity to refashion the world in which we live. Now, I'm not really sure how you put that in an AOP, but that's certainly something I think is worth thinking about.
It's actually very exciting prospects. Well, we've had a question from someone who's watching online. Ketan, could you field this one for us with your Pacific Capital hat on? Do you think that the heightened risk scenarios that we've been talking about are making people invest in different kinds of businesses or different kinds of sectors than before?
It's difficult to tell, actually. Well, here's what I am seeing, that there's a new customer emerging which you can target because of the data that's now available, because of technology and access. So we didn't have access to a customer base because it was not profitable to serve them. The technology, fintech, edutech, medical technologies and so on, have allowed us to serve people in completely different markets that are a long way away that you would not have bothered to go to. And so what I am seeing is this technology-driven access and data-driven understanding of who the customer is, whether it's a customer in the town next door or in a country thousands of miles away, is now possible. And the most exciting and profitable opportunities we're seeing are this ability to access people you could not access to serve. And it's very scalable. It's enormously scalable to see that. As you heard, you invest in unicorns. And what we're seeing is, in our funds, we're finding almost half the companies have potential to become a unicorn within 2 to 3 years, enabled by technology and access. And so the opportunities are enormous in this time of big change.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions in the audience here for our panel? Well, I'll take another one from our online viewers. Linda, which new technologies do you think might fuel future global growth?
Really great questions, actually, coming from online. At the moment, I would probably, that Yueh said, the problem about predictions is that it's about the future. So I'm going to stick with the present, which is and this touches on actually quite a few things that we've already covered in the panel. The area of payments in fintech is probably one of the fastest developing areas. And I know this is probably of great interest to this audience. Many of you will have dealt with them. The reason it's important economically is what fintech can do in the payment space. And this is itself a disaggregation from existing financial institutions like yours, Bruce. They're picking off payments from established companies, and they're cutting the fees. So it's disintermediation in the sense they're stepping into one space, cutting the fees by offering services. For instance, I'm not really sure if I should name companies, but because where's that disclaimer? Please do not listen to anything I say and invest on the basis of this, anybody who's watching. But in the FX space, the fees are so high, fintech companies have come in to cut that fee, and they're able to take market share on the basis of that. We see it on payments companies clearly as well. We also see it in terms of they're offering credit, so buy now, pay later. You're probably thinking of the company names I'm thinking of. But they're going beyond that. A number of the Silicon Valley companies are actually offering disaggregated business services, specifically targeting SMEs. They're literally disaggregating this entire space, and a number of these companies are unicorns already. They're worth over $1 billion, and they're staying private for longer because they are able to use network effects, which is one of the big drivers of technological change, to do that. So why do I think this is the most important growth area? Because there's just under 2 billion people in the world who are underbanked. They actually don't have access to banking accounts. So what these payment transfer companies are able to do, and I'm thinking of the evidence around M-Pesa, which is a Safaricom and Vodafone collaboration in Kenya. So in Kenya, economic studies have shown that M-Pesa, very widely used, allows people who don't have savings accounts to make payments and transfers, and it translates savings into investments for the economy, which is the role of the financial sector. And it's actually been found to raise total factor productivity of Kenya, raising the overall productivity of the country, which translates into higher incomes, higher wages, and a bigger economy. And that is what we're ultimately looking for. So this area, to me, has already shown you can actually transform people's lives by bringing them into the financial system, very simply with an app on their phone. And I think it has transformative potential and offers huge challenge as well to the existing players. So, Bruce.
Bruce, do you want to come back on that?
I'd make a slightly different point. I think in my personal investment portfolio, clearly I want to choose successful technologies over unsuccessful technologies. But I think the real point for those of us in the room is to make sure we enable all of these technologies to develop and then let the winners come through. And so I would anchor my own focus back in things like skills, transfer of skills across borders, data, we've talked about it, freedom of movement of data, and also, of course, freedom of movement of capital. And if we can bring capital and data and skills to bear, then the ingenuity we talked about before can flourish, and some of that will succeed and some of that won't. But collectively, I think we'll move things forward. And so it's this enabling piece that I get more excited about than trying to spot individual winners and losers technologically.
We talked about winners and losers in terms of businesses, but we've had a question asking, and I wonder, Bill, if you want to look at this one, which countries do you think are best positioned to take advantage of the investment trends that we've been talking about?
Funny, I'll use China as the example, and compare China with the established banks. I'll look at things through a banking lens. But if you think of the big banks in China, compare them with the big banks in Western Europe, here in the UK, in North America, they're at a tremendous advantage because they are late movers. And you've got big banks that are saddled with legacy issues, that have a patchwork of systems, that are trying to tie together their IT systems through years of growth, through acquisitions and mergers, while the big banks in China, they have pretty much a single platform or a small collection of platforms there. And I'm familiar with a lot of big banks around the world. They are far more agile when it comes to risk data aggregation, risk reporting, risk management, because they operate from one system, and they're not saddled with the legacy issues. The amount of money, it's shocking the amount of money that any bank needs to invest on an annual basis just to maintain their systems, let alone enhance the systems to compete with fintechs. And I do advisory work for fintechs, and I support everything Linda has said. There's tremendous value in some of this innovation that's being developed, and it's more and more difficult for big banks to compete. But I think China, in many respects, because they are a late mover, they are at a distinct advantage because of that.
Ketan, do you have a view on that?
I was going to say, in our work in Force for Good, we analysed 100 of the largest financial institutions in the world. They represent $170 trillion. And so, we have everything from the big American financial institutions, European, Africa, India, and so on. We were looking for three things that they do. One is, what do they do for ESG? Is it policy all the way down to practices? Two, how do they allocate their capital to make a sustainable impact? And three, what do they do with their stakeholders beyond shareholders? We collect something like 450 data points across these hundreds. So it's the biggest database of essentially what are you doing to be good? And how does that correlate to returns? Here's what we found. There's about a dozen of them which over a 5-year period and a 10-year period make 6 to 8 times more shareholder return than the rest, than the MSCI average. So it's meaningful to be an organization that is leading and innovating by trying to make an impact profitably. They're very profitable businesses too. This is a correlation rather than causality, but it's a significant correlation. Two, what we found was that the biggest risk takers were Americans, American banks. They place $1 trillion bets on things like climate change. And there's a club of them, effectively, of 6 to 8 financial institutions that are willing to put $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion on a climate change issue. There's another group of them, mainly Americans too, which are willing to invest $10 to $30 billion at a time on something like black equity. Obviously a big issue for them. They don't think their government's going to tackle it well. But the reason they do it is they think they can make their black poor customers profitable now because of technology. And so they found a way to do that. And to do that, they'll have to regenerate parts of the city that these poor populations live in to do that. And this is a massive project. It's a 10-year project. So what we found was, where are the Chinese in this? Most of them don't have comprehensive ESG programs, sustainable development measurements, and aren't ready, really, for this new world. What we found was, even amongst the top 100, it was splitting between those that are the most advanced, innovative, aggressive risk takers on a global basis to invest, and those that think the job of a bank is to process bits of paper for a mortgage application or an insurance application or something else. The DNA of the first will be resilient, fit for purpose, and will create the new world. And the latter will figure out how to catch up, or will be superseded by the sort of fintech Linda was talking about that will scale. Yeah. And I think that's the world. That's again an innovative world, but tough competitive world.
So we've had a vote for China, a vote for America. Bruce, do you think there's something to be said about the DNA that Ketan was talking about there here in London?
Well, I think London has been a host to enormous amounts of ingenuity and investment over recent decades, and part of our angst is whether we're going to continue to host these levels of investment, bring these skills and capital together, and that in part underpins what we're doing here today is trying to make sure that we not only preserve London's leadership position, because it has a leadership position in the global financial services and professional services space, but how do we enhance it? And these geopolitical issues, these issues of health risks, these issues of climate change, things all appear to threaten the status quo, which comes back to this issue of how do we keep adapting to make sure what we do, the skills that we have, what we represent in London are going to be relevant to people, to investment, to growth in the future.
And do you see some of the advantages here that we were hearing about in China and the States?
Yes, I mean, again, you can always pick out people that are stuck in legacy and challenged, and then you can pick out others that are in a better place. But to be hosting it, to be in the middle of the flows, to have the expertise are, to my mind, the right ingredients to enable this to happen. And I think we start in a really good place in the UK and specifically in London. And the challenge on us is to keep going with that and to keep expanding. And in many ways, it's kind of ours to lose at this point. But each decision we make either helps or hurts along the way. And that's why we've got to be very thoughtful about how we do this.
If I could just add to that, I mean, I think the kind of the European tech scene is changing quite a lot. And the center of the financing, a big part of the financing actually is in the UK. And for all of the reasons that Bruce has outlined. So what you're finding is because of there are a number of emerging, sort of tech hubs across Europe, but you can link the financing to London and to other European capitals. But if, for instance, if you look at the emerging green tech scene in Stockholm and Switzerland, they also obviously have other fintechs. The financing is still actually coming from and preserving our role as this hub for international investment, for services. That is absolutely key. And I think all the issues around treatment of people, the rule of law, all the things that we've heard today, and the ecosystem is absolutely important. So I think, this to me is one of the most exciting areas. And for what it's worth, the American VC firms are moving to London, and they're treating this as a base to invest in potential unicorns across Europe. So to me, that suggests that that's a good sign for the UK increasing competitiveness, but it also means that the existing players here need to get their skates on, because this is again, we could be on the cusp of Europe producing the kinds of global tech companies that could rival the Americans and the Chinese, and some of the ones that you have already seen, the Spotifys and the Klarnas. There are, I think, the beginnings of this, which is why the Americans are coming. That sounds very revolutionary.
It's like a film. Okay.
I know Stephen's fault, making me think of history.
Well, look, I'm very glad you talked about funds, because I think we've got a chance for one last question from the audience. And Ketan, if I can address this to you. It says, launching a first fund is challenging. I'm sure you've experienced that firsthand. How can we make more capital and funding available for emerging and first-time fund managers focusing on impact investing?
When impact investing, I think, is profitable, and if you look at the business model that way, it will attract the capital. If you want to make an impact, but you want to do it as a corporate social responsibility endeavor, it's much tougher to get the capital. But there is enough money in the world chasing very good funds. But you have to demonstrate that you can address the world's issues profitably. And if you can do that, I think you'll find the money. It's tough, but you'll find it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And look, I'm afraid we do have to end it there, but I'd just like to say a huge thanks to my panel. Newsrooms at the moment are pretty gloomy places, and so it's been absolutely fantastic not only to hear set out some of the issues that we're facing, but also some of the positives that we can take from our current situation and the optimistic future that I think you've all mapped out for us. So if I could say Bruce Carnegie-Brown, Linda Yueh, Ketan Patel and Bill Coen, thank you very much. If you could all give them a round of applause, please.